afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to today's reading of Bonfire. So today we're going to be reading Chapter 5. So settle back and enjoy. Okay. Chapter 5. We'd been blessed with a smooth crossing for almost the whole 12 days, but our luck was about to change with terrible effect. A storm blew up over the waters with gale-force winds. Our big ships were tossed about like so many toys in a turbulent tub. We horses and mules banged our heads and smashed against our stalls and into each other. Some horses fell and scrambled to their feet again. I tried to calm myself with hopes of a visit from the Major, but I learned that he was run off his feet by attending to injuries of both soldiers and horses. Thankfully, we only had a short journey in the storm before arriving at Plymouth, and the injuries were minor. We began then the complicated and time-consuming, chaotic chore of disembarking 30,000 men and nearly 8,000 horses. We were all to be loaded onto trains and taken to the training ground on Salisbury Plain. Our brigade's disembarkation wasn't as confusing as the others, since we had our own ship and no one other than the 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery was on it. As we left our ships, after much waiting, we received a rousing welcome from the English people. Hundreds of well-wishers scouted and cheered and showered our soldiers with kisses and hugs, cigarettes and candies. The Major and Dodge had the good sense to give their peppermints to me. Yum. It took 9 days for all of us, the entire Canadian Expeditionary Force, to come ashore and get aboard our trains. On the quay, a tough-looking, battle-scarred English sergeant saluted and spoke to the Major and Captain Cosgrave as they walked ahead of Dodge and me. "Sirs," he nodded, "it's a good job you Canadians have brought more horses. We're going excuse me. We're going through an awful whack of them in France." My ears perked up anxiously. What did he mean? Going through horses? As Dodge led me by an enthusiastic group of civilians, an elderly woman in a bonnet with silver curls framing her face spoke loudly. "I say, I thought there would be more Indians with them." Dodge snorted and muttered, "There are quite a few, and they're in uniform like everyone else. Did she think they'd be in buckskins and beads? Humph." The Major wanted to ride to his lodgings and not bother with the train at all, but Colonel Morrison convinced him otherwise. How I would have loved to stretch out and travel a few miles on foot. It was not to be. Back onto the cramped train we went, and just like the one I had taken from Dr. Todd's to Valcartier. At least I was with King again, happy to be with a friend. On a wide-open and windswept corner of the rolling Salisbury Plain, the North Brigade moved into another sea of white bell tents at West Down North Camp, much like the ones in Camp Valcartier. This was the only similarity. The balmy summer of Valcartier gave way to the worst winters in English memory. Out of 123 days, it rained for 89 of them. The Major made a sort of lean-to shelter for me near his bell tent out of scrounged canvas and wood, but the vast majority of horses and mules had no shelter at all. Not a single stick for protection from the weather. The soldiers were forbidden to chop down any trees near the camp. There was also a sign standing over the Salisbury Plain, "No picketing of horses in the trees." We had no idea why these rules were enforced. They seemed arbitrary. In the absence of any materials that be used for horse shelters, at least the trees would have offered some protection from the lashing rains and icy winds. The Major and I rode out to Bustard Camp one day and passed lines of our own artillery horses. They were tied and stood soaking wet in the wind-battered open. There was Thor, shivering in the middle of them, the unmistakable sliver of a crescent moon on his face. The whole line had their backs to the wind, ears back and heads down. Pure misery. Magnus and Monty stoically anchored one end of the line. Thor raised his head slightly as we passed. I'm not sure his dull eyes showed any recognition. Like trenchfoot, a dreadful condition similar to frostbite the soldiers would experience in the months to come, as a result in standing of trenches full of water and mud, horses on the Salisbury Plain were stricken with their own version, hoof rot, or more correctly, gangrenous dermatitis. It was as awful as it sounds. The Major and I tried to ride out every day, but some days were just too awful for training and drilling of men, or even riding. And nothing at all could be done. In fact, the Major hardly got to do any artillery drills or duties at all at first, due to the sickness that the weather was fostered. He spent most of his days examining soldiers one after another on sick parade. Everything in the military seemed to be called a parade. Sick parade, church parade. He said most cases on sick parade were genuine too. Not many malingerers, which were soldiers who only pretended to be sick to get out of work or drilling. Before the military, the only parades I had ever seen were festive ones. The bone-chilling November day as we toured camp, a loud voice shouted, "McCrae! Major McCrae!" The Major turned to look, and so did I. There was a stout, balding man, a civilian, with glasses and a thick black mustache. His black umbrella was threatening to turn inside out in the wind. I could feel the Major's excitement run through him into me. He fairly leapt to the ground and dismount and dragged me to the man by my reins as they extended their arms and shook hands vigorously. "Rudyard Kipling! Mr. Kipling, how are you, sir?" "I am very well. It's good to see you." Kipling pointedly looked up at the black sky. "Can you Canadians not place yourself somewhere of a more moderate climate?" The two men laughed. "I believe the last time we met was in the blazing heat of South Africa." "Yes, it was," said the Major. "Well, that was quite a different war. My boy, Jack, is in this one." He swelled up with pride as he declared, "He's in the Irish Guards." "You don't say," said the Major. "Congratulations, you must be very proud." "I am. He is in France and off to the front as we speak." "We shall pray for his safe return, then." Kipling took out his pocket watch as a car pulled up for him. "I have to dash, but I'll be back for lunch tomorrow. We'll catch up. I hear you're soldiering and doctoring too this time. Is that right?" "Mainly doctoring at the moment, today anyway, but I'll serve wherever the call is the loudest. And right now, this appalling weather is keeping me busy in treating the soldiers with colds, pneumonia, flu, bronchitis." "I shouldn't wonder. Say, Colonel Morrison tells me you're quite the poet, too. A man of many talents. I'd love to read some of your pieces sometime." The Major instantly blushed, something I hadn't seen before. Well, I dabble a bit. Certainly nothing to the caliber of your work, sir." "Oh, now," Kipling said, wagging his finger. "You're being modest. Well, it's good to see you again, Major. We'll talk over lunch." As the two men shook hands again, I realized a small crowd of soldiers had gathered and were watching and whispering. This Kipling, I later found out, was the famous writer of the Todd children's favorite collection of stories, The Jungle Book. I found it strange the people the war brought together. I also found it strange that he was so happy about his boy being off to the front. Humans befuddle me sometimes. Kipling climbed into the car and drove off with a breezy wave as the sky opened up again. The Major mounted and we carried off to the Bustard camp. The Major wanted to check on the wooden huts that were being built for the soldiers. The soldiers were in amazingly good form and spirits given the conditions. Other than the irritation of lice or vermin, as the major referred to them, the men's suffering could not be compared to that of the horses. They seemed to be able to joke about their lot, and some of the soldiers even composed poems and songs about the conditions. One poem in particular gave the major a good laugh. How I loved to hear that deep, full-throated laugh. It always warmed my insides. Captain Cosgrave recited it one day after lunch. First, he straightened his cap from its usual rakish angle. He then rested a hand on an old table outside the officers' mess tent, like an opera singer at a grand piano. With formality and grand hand gestures, he cleared his throat and began. On Salisbury Plain. On Salisbury Plain, under gloomy skies, the mud doth lie. At this point, he stopped and explained. Doth, he said, exhaling loudly through his teeth and wiping his mouth with his handkerchief. Doth is English for does. The men laughed as he began again. Someone at the back shouted, Get on with it! More laughter. On Salisbury Plain under gloomy skies, the mud doth lie. Up to our knees, even up to our thighs, the mud doth lie. Mud in our hair, even mud in our eyes, mud in our snake and pygmy pies. He coughed and cleared his throat. Do pardon me, mud in our steak and kidney pies. Mud under dirty, rotten, gloomy skies on Salisbury Plain. At Bustard Camp, Major checked on the progress of the men's huts, but just as important to him, was there any sign of shelters being built for the horses yet? No, not one sign that we could see. He headed back to camp, and I could feel the Major's disappointment. Back in our camp, the Major's mood brightened again. We were greeted by a beautiful tiger-striped gray cat that the Major had christened Miss Kitty. If the weather was fair at all, she would come outside and wind herself around my legs. And if I put my muzzle down to her, she would stand right up on her hind legs and rub her face against my nose, which made me sneeze and the Major laugh. But even if one raindrop came down, she would dive into the Major's tent and snuggle into his bed. He told Dodge he didn't want to get too attached to her because we'd be leaving soon, and then what would become of her? Dodge said to me, Master Bonfire, it's too late. He dotes on Miss Kitty already. The Major is an old softy for the creatures, but you would know that, he said, and I certainly did. The people were great letter writers in those days, and the Major was one of the most diligent. He wrote letters daily to friends and family, and received them from his mother, his brother Tom, also a doctor, and his sister Gillis. Gillis was married with children and lived in Winnipeg. She sent him a book by his friend from Montreal, Stephen Laycock. It was funny to hear him burst into laughter from inside his tent every so often as he read it. The Major and Stephen Laycock belonged to an informal club in Montreal called the Pen and Pencil Club, whereby they would meet every 2 weeks and read their writings, poetry, short stories, essays, and so on. Colonel Morrison said the Pen and Pencil Club was code for the Scotch Drinking Club, which I didn't quite understand. The Major always chuckled when he said it, though. He was writing at a small table outside of his tent when Lex came to ask him about how the horse shelter progressed. After the Major updated him on the not-so-good news, the young lieutenant asked with impatience, When are we going over to France, Major? It'll all be finished before we get there, and we'll miss the whole show. They say it'll be over by Christmas. And that is a stupid statement to make. We'll get over soon enough, Lex. We haven't even had proper drills and training yet because of all this. The Major spread out his arms, and we looked at all the morass in front of us. I say we learn by doing, Lex persisted. No better teacher than experience, don't you agree, Major? In some things, son, but not in artillery fighting. War is serious business. The better the training, the more effective we are, and the more likely we'll be able to come through. I wondered about what he meant. Come through. Come through what? I didn't like the sound of that. ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of chapter 5. So there's one piece of the book that I wanted to come back and mention at the end of the chapter. It was mentioned very briefly at the beginning of the chapter, where the old lady was wondering, oh, well, she thought she'd see more Indians, and how Dodge said, well, there are lots, but they're in uniform. One of the major roles in World War I and World War II of many of the North American natives was code talkers. Now, code talkers are often thought to be Navajo, from the Navajo tribe in the southern U.S., but not just Navajo. Cree speakers as well also played a major role in code talkers. There were many different languages. Now, what are code talkers? What a code talker is an individual who speaks a little understood language by the majority of the individuals in the war. So, for example, like up in northern Alberta here, Cree is a very common First Nations language. And, well, most people who don't have a Cree background can't understand or speak Cree. And I myself, I only think I know 2 words. I know Tanse, which is welcome, and Nukumsk, which is grandma, which is the nickname I earned from a Cree elder who was old enough to be my grandpa. So that's another funny story for later. But the code talkers would communicate over radio and would speak in this case, Cree, and they would then be able to understand each other. But if anyone overheard it or intercepted the message, they couldn't understand it. And the people on the opposing side, so the German army, could not understand Cree at all, and they didn't have people who could speak Cree. So, or Navajo, or any of the other languages, Mohawk, or as well. So it was very, very important part of the war. And that little tiny blurb in Bonfire is a nod to the efforts of the First Nations people in World War I and then later in World War II. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you guys found that interesting, and definitely research the code talkers. Some pretty cool stuff. So, ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned for our next video of Bonfire, which will be chapter 6. All right, have a good day, ladies and gentlemen. Bye.